Halloween morning, 2020. Sean's breathing had become labored. Micheline held his hand, reading from a 50-year-old love letter. Je t'aime pour toujours, she whispered in French. Sean's eyes opened one last time, looking at Micheline. In that moment, she felt he recognized her. Sean Connery quietly closed his eyes, while holding the hand of the woman he loved. A 90-year life had come to an end. But this story isn't about death. It's about love that transcends memory, devotion that conquers disease, and the cruel irony of a man who played the world's most unforgettable spy, becoming unable to remember his own wife's name. If you've ever wondered what true love looks like when everything else falls away, subscribe now, because what Micheline Connery endured in those final years will change how you think about marriage, memory, and the bonds that truly matter. The changes began so subtly that Micheline almost convinced herself she was imagining them. It was late autumn of 2017 when she first noticed Sean repeating the same story about his 1953 Mr. Universe competition, not just once, but 3 times during a single dinner party. The man who had captivated audiences for decades with his razor-sharp wit and commanding presence seemed to lose his thread mid-conversation, his legendary confidence flickering like a candle in the wind. At first, Micheline attributed these lapses to normal aging. Sean was 87 after all, and had lived a life more intense than most people could imagine. The physical demands of his early Bond films, the stress of global fame, the emotional toll of decades in Hollywood. Surely some mental fatigue was understandable, but as weeks turned to months, the incidents became impossible to ignore. Sean would forget appointments he'd made just hours earlier, struggle to remember the names of colleagues he'd worked with for years, and sometimes stare at familiar photographs with genuine confusion. The diagnosis came on a grey December morning in Nassau, delivered by Dr. Patricia Williams, a neurologist who had flown in from Miami specifically to examine Sean. Micheline sat beside her husband of 45 years, as Dr. Williams explained the test results with clinical precision: early-stage Alzheimer's disease, progressing more rapidly than typical for someone Sean's age. The words hit Micheline like physical blows: cognitive decline, memory loss, eventual complete dependency. Sean himself seemed oddly detached from the news, as if the doctor were discussing someone else entirely. When Dr. Williams finished speaking, he simply nodded and asked, "When do we start treatment?" His matter-of-fact acceptance broke Micheline's heart more than any emotional outburst could have. This was Sean Connery, the man who had faced down gangsters, conquered Hollywood, and charmed royalty, reduced to asking how to fight an enemy he couldn't see, touch, or intimidate into submission. That night, after Sean had gone to bed with his customary "good night, darling," Micheline sat alone in their Bahamian living room and wept. The ocean breeze that had always brought her comfort now seemed to whisper of loss and endings. She understood with terrifying clarity that the man she had fallen in love with in Morocco 47 years earlier was beginning to disappear, one memory at a time. But the cruelest irony was yet to reveal itself. As Sean's condition progressed through 2018, a strange pattern emerged that baffled doctors and broke Micheline's heart in equal measure. The man who could no longer remember what he'd eaten for breakfast or recognize longtime friends retained perfect recall for one specific aspect of his past: James Bond. Not just the character, but entire scenes, dialogue exchanges, and even technical details from films he'd made 50 years earlier. Dr. Williams explained that Alzheimer's often preserves deeply embedded memories while erasing recent ones, but Sean's selective retention went beyond medical explanation. When Micheline played John Barry's iconic Goldfinger theme on their baby grand piano, Sean's vacant expression would suddenly sharpen with laser focus. His shoulders would straighten, his jaw would set in that familiar determined line, and he would murmur, shaken, not stirred, with the same precise diction that had made the phrase legendary. These moments of clarity became Micheline's lifeline and her torture. For brief shining minutes she would have her husband back, not just the memory of him but the actual man, complete with his dry humor and magnetic presence. He would comment on the music, sometimes even hum along with perfect pitch. But when the melodies faded, Sean would drift back into the grey fog of confusion, leaving Micheline alone again, with a stranger wearing her husband's face. The irony wasn't lost on her that Bond, the role Sean had famously declared he hated and wanted to kill, now served as his only anchor to identity. The character he'd spent decades trying to escape had become his sole pathway back to himself. Micheline began incorporating Bond music into their daily routine, playing the themes during meals, baths, and quiet evening hours. She learned to read the subtle changes in Sean's posture and breathing that signaled his return to awareness, treasuring these fragments of connection like precious jewels. Sean Connery, visiting from London in early 2019, was devastated to witness his father's transformation. The man who had taught him strength, integrity, and the importance of standing up for one's beliefs now sat silently for hours, staring out at the Caribbean waters with no recognition of his own son. But when Jason mentioned the Aston Martin DB5 from Goldfinger, Sean's head turned with sudden interest, and he began describing the car's hidden gadgets with startling accuracy. "It's like Dad has been divided into two people," Jason confided to Micheline later that evening. "The man who raised me is gone, but James Bond is still in there, waiting." Micheline nodded, understanding exactly what he meant. She had become the caretaker, not just of her husband, but of the ghost of cinema's most famous secret agent. But caring for a legend would demand everything she had. By 2019, Micheline's life had transformed into an endless cycle of small kindnesses and patient repetitions that would have broken a less devoted person. Every morning at exactly 7 o'clock, she would wake Sean with gentle touches and soft French endearments, then guide him through the basic routines that kept him connected to dignity and humanity. The morning ritual became sacred to Micheline, a daily renewal of their marriage vows through action rather than words. She would help Sean shower, carefully washing his still thick silver hair and ensuring the water temperature was perfect. He rarely spoke during these intimate moments, but sometimes his eyes would find hers in the bathroom mirror, and she would see flashes of gratitude mixed with confusion. "Who is this beautiful woman caring for me?" his expression seemed to ask, even as his heart remembered what his mind could not. Dressing Sean required infinite patience as his fine motor skills deteriorated. The man who had once epitomized masculine elegance now struggled with shirt buttons and shoelaces. Micheline would lay out his clothes each morning, always well coordinated, always maintaining the dignity that had defined Sean's public image. She refused to let him wear the institutional clothing that many dementia patients eventually required, instead investing in specially designed garments that looked normal, but accommodated his declining abilities. Breakfast became a delicate negotiation between nutrition and Sean's increasingly childlike preferences. He developed an obsession with marmalade on toast, sometimes eating nothing else for days. Micheline learned to hide vitamins in his orange juice and find creative ways to ensure he consumed enough protein. She would sit across from him at their dining table, maintaining cheerful conversation even when he didn't respond, creating the illusion of normalcy for both their sakes. The afternoons were perhaps the most challenging. Sean's restlessness would increase as the day progressed, and he would often try to leave the house, convinced he had somewhere important to be. Micheline couldn't risk letting him wander. The Bahamas' heat and his disorientation could prove fatal within hours. Instead, she developed an elaborate system of distractions, photo albums from his filming days, classical music, and always the Bond soundtracks that could still capture his attention. Evenings brought their own heartbreak. Sean would sometimes look at family photographs with genuine bewilderment, unable to identify himself in publicity stills from Dr. No or Goldfinger. But occasionally, late at night when the house was quiet, Micheline would catch him humming the From Russia with Love theme with perfect pitch, his fingers conducting an invisible orchestra. These moments reminded her that somewhere inside the fog of disease, the essence of Sean Connery still existed. The physical demands of 24-hour care began taking their toll on Micheline's 75-year-old body. Friends urged her to hire professional help or consider specialized facilities, but she refused every suggestion. "I promised him 45 years ago that we would face everything together," she told concerned visitors. "This is everything." But even Micheline couldn't have prepared for what came next. The most devastating change arrived in late 2019, when Sean stopped recognizing Micheline altogether. The woman who had been his companion, confidante, and greatest love for nearly half a century, became just another stranger in his increasingly unfamiliar world. Each morning, when she approached his bedside with her gentle smile and soft "Bonjour, mon amour," Sean would regard her with polite confusion, sometimes asking, "Who are you? What are you doing in my house?" These daily rejections felt like small deaths to Micheline. She had prepared herself for many aspects of Sean's decline, but nothing had equipped her for the soul-crushing experience of being forgotten by the person who knew her better than anyone else in the world. The man who once wrote her passionate love letters in broken French, who had proposed marriage by painting her portrait in Morocco, who had whispered her name in moments of deepest intimacy, now looked at her with the blank courtesy reserved for helpful strangers. Yet Micheline never stopped trying to reach him. Each morning, she would reintroduce herself with the same patient warmth. "Hello, Sean. I'm Micheline, your wife. I've been taking care of you because I love you very much." Sometimes he would nod politely and thank her for her kindness. Other times he would become agitated, insisting that his wife was someone else entirely, occasionally mentioning Diane Cilento, his first wife who had died nearly a decade earlier. The medical team explained that this confusion was typical of advanced Alzheimer's, where the brain reaches back to earlier, more deeply embedded memories. But understanding the clinical reasoning didn't ease Micheline's anguish when Sean would ask about his wife Diane, or wonder when she was coming to visit. In those moments, Micheline would quietly excuse herself to weep in private, then return with renewed determination to provide comfort to the man who no longer knew her name. Photography became both a blessing and a curse during this period. Micheline would show Sean their wedding pictures from 1975, hoping to spark recognition. He would study the images intently, sometimes commenting on what a lovely couple they made, never realizing he was looking at himself and his devoted caregiver. When she showed him pictures of their travels together, the vineyards of France, the beaches of Mauritius, the golf courses of Scotland, he would respond with polite interest, as if viewing vacation photos belonging to acquaintances. The nights were perhaps worst of all. Sean often became convinced that strangers had invaded his house, referring to Micheline and their live-in nurse as those women who wouldn't leave him alone. He would sometimes barricade himself in his bedroom, shouting for help and demanding that someone call the police. Micheline would sit outside his door for hours, speaking in soothing tones, until exhaustion finally claimed him. Then she would quietly enter to check his breathing, adjust his covers, and kiss his forehead while he slept peacefully, temporarily free from the confusion that plagued his waking hours. Friends who visited during this period were shocked by the transformation. This titan of cinema, this man who had commanded attention in every room he entered, now seemed diminished and frightened by his own home. But they were equally amazed by Micheline's unwavering devotion. She never showed impatience, never raised her voice, never treated Sean as anything less than the love of her life, even when he couldn't remember her name. But music would provide one final bridge between them. As 2020 arrived, Sean's verbal communication had almost entirely disappeared. Days would pass without him speaking more than a few scattered words, and even those were often incomprehensible. The commanding voice that had delivered iconic lines in 7 Bond films, that had charmed presidents and captivated audiences worldwide, was reduced to occasional murmurs and sighs. But Micheline discovered that music could still reach places in Sean's mind that words could no longer access. The revelation came during a particularly difficult afternoon, when Sean had been agitated and unresponsive for hours. In desperation, Micheline sat at their piano and began playing the haunting melody from You Only Live Twice. The change in Sean was immediate and profound. His restless movements ceased, his breathing deepened, and for the first time in weeks, he looked directly at Micheline with something approaching recognition. Encouraged by this breakthrough, Micheline began incorporating live musical performances into their daily routine. She would play Bond themes in the morning to help calm Sean during his care routine, classical pieces during meals to aid his focus, and gentle ballads in the evening to ease his transition to sleep. Her fingers found their way through compositions she hadn't played in decades, muscle memory guiding her through pieces that seemed to unlock doors in Sean's damaged mind. The most remarkable discovery was Sean's retained ability to hum along with familiar melodies. Though he could no longer speak in sentences, he could still produce the iconic five-note fanfare from the Bond gun barrel sequence with perfect pitch. When Micheline played the sweeping orchestral theme from Russia with Love, Sean would close his eyes and conduct along with invisible musicians, his movements showing a grace and precision that had vanished from all his other activities. Dr. Williams, monitoring Sean's condition through regular video consultations, was fascinated by this musical connection. Music often remains accessible to Alzheimer's patients long after other cognitive functions have deteriorated, she explained to Micheline. But Sean's response is unusually strong and specific. These aren't just random musical memories, they're tied to his core identity in ways that transcend normal neurological patterns. Jason visited again in the spring of 2020, bringing his own guitar to join Micheline's piano sessions. Father and son had shared a love of music throughout Jason's childhood, and hearing his son play seemed to stir something deep within Sean's consciousness. Though he couldn't speak his son's name or acknowledge their relationship, Sean would sometimes reach out to touch the guitar strings, his fingers moving as if remembering chords from long ago. The most poignant musical moments came late at night, when the house was quiet, and Micheline would play softly in the adjacent room. Sometimes she would hear Sean humming along from his bedroom, his voice carrying melodies that had defined his career and shaped his legend. In those darkness-wrapped minutes, time seemed suspended, and Micheline could almost pretend that her husband was still truly present, still sharing their life together through the universal language of music. These musical interludes became Micheline's primary source of hope during Sean's darkest period. Even when everything else about him seemed lost, music proved that some essential part of Sean Connery remained alive beneath the ravages of disease. It wasn't the man she had married, but it was unmistakably connected to him, a golden thread stretching back through decades of shared memories to their earliest days together in Morocco. But even music couldn't stop what was coming. The summer of 2020 brought an accelerated decline that even Micheline's fierce devotion couldn't slow. Sean's mobility decreased dramatically, requiring assistance for all movement beyond sitting up in bed. His appetite diminished to almost nothing, and keeping him nourished became a constant struggle. Most heartbreaking of all, even the musical connections that had sustained them through the previous months began to fade, as if the last bridges to Sean's consciousness were finally burning away. Dr. Williams increased her virtual consultations, gently preparing Micheline for what medical professionals call the final stage. Sean's body was shutting down systematically, his once powerful frame becoming increasingly frail despite Micheline's meticulous care. Weight loss made his famous facial features more pronounced, lending him an almost ethereal quality that reminded visitors of classical sculptures weathered by time. Sleep became Sean's primary state, with brief periods of semi-consciousness that grew shorter and more infrequent. During these wakeful moments, he rarely opened his eyes, but Micheline learned to read the subtle changes in his breathing and facial expressions that indicated awareness. She would use these precious minutes to speak to him in French, sharing memories of their travels, their quiet moments together, and her enduring love for the man who had filled her life with adventure and joy. The practical aspects of end-stage care would have overwhelmed most people, but Micheline approached each challenge with the same determination that had sustained her throughout their marriage. She coordinated with hospice nurses, managed medications, and ensured that Sean's physical comfort remained paramount. Yet she never allowed their home to feel clinical or institutional. Fresh flowers filled every room, classical music played softly throughout the day, and she maintained all the small rituals that had defined their life together. Jason spent August and September in Nassau, recognizing that his father's time was limited. The experience of watching Sean's final decline bonded father and son in ways that years of normal interaction might not have achieved. Jason would sit beside Sean's bed for hours, reading aloud from Ian Fleming's original novels, or sharing stories about his own career and family. Though Sean showed no obvious signs of comprehension, Jason felt certain that some part of his father was listening and finding comfort in his presence. Friends from around the world called daily, sharing memories and asking about Sean's condition. Micheline spoke to each caller personally, finding strength in their love and concern. Michael Caine, Sean's close friend since their work together on The Man Who Would Be King, called every few days from London, sometimes just to tell Micheline that she was in his thoughts. These connections to the wider world helped sustain her through the loneliest moments of caregiving. October brought a noticeable change in Sean's breathing patterns and skin tone that indicated his body was preparing for the final transition. Micheline began sleeping in a chair beside his bed, unwilling to risk missing his last moments. She read to him from their old love letters, played his favorite classical pieces, and maintained a constant stream of gentle conversation, creating a cocoon of love and familiarity around his departing spirit. Halloween morning would bring the end of an extraordinary journey. October 31st, 2020. Dawned grey and unusually cool for Nassau, as if the weather itself was acknowledging the solemnity of the day. Micheline had been awake since before sunrise, maintaining her vigil beside Sean's bed, while monitoring the increasingly laboured rhythm of his breathing. The hospice nurse had warned her that the end was approaching, but nothing could have prepared her for the emotional weight of these final hours. Sean's breathing had become increasingly shallow throughout the night, with longer pauses between each inhalation that made Micheline's heart skip in momentary panic. Yet somehow she knew this Halloween morning would be different. There was a quality to the light filtering through their bedroom windows that felt like a gentle benediction, a peaceful conclusion to months of struggle and decline. At approximately 9:30 in the morning, Sean's eyes opened for what would be the final time. For just a moment, his gaze found Micheline's face with a clarity that had been absent for months. In that brief connection, she felt certain he recognized her, not as the stranger who had been caring for him, but as Micheline, his wife, his companion, his greatest love. The recognition lasted only seconds, but it carried the weight of 45 years of shared history. Micheline took his hand gently, feeling how thin and fragile it had become compared to the strong hands that had once held her during their first dance in Morocco. She began reading from a love letter he had written to her in 1975, shortly after their marriage. The words, written in Sean's careful handwriting on hotel stationery from their honeymoon in the French Riviera, spoke of eternal devotion and the joy he had found in sharing his life with such an extraordinary woman. As she read, Micheline noticed Sean's breathing, becoming even more peaceful, as if her voice and the familiar words were providing comfort during his transition. When she finished the letter, she leaned close to his ear and whispered the same French endearment she had spoken to him every day for decades. Je t'aime pour toujours, mon cœur. I love you forever, my heart. Sean's final breath came so gently that Micheline almost missed it. There was no struggle, no distress, simply a quiet exhalation that didn't pause for the next inhalation. The man who had brought James Bond to life, who had conquered Hollywood and charmed the world, slipped away as peacefully as someone falling asleep after a long, eventful day. Micheline continued holding his hand for nearly an hour after his passing, speaking softly about their life together and thanking him for the privilege of loving and being loved by someone so remarkable. When she finally called the hospice nurse and then Jason to share the news, her voice was steady despite her tears. Sean Connery had died exactly as he had lived, with dignity, surrounded by love, and on his own terms. The world mourned Sean Connery's passing as the death of a legend, but for Micheline, it marked the end of a love story that had spanned nearly 5 decades. The final 3 years of caregiving, though heartbreaking, had revealed depths of devotion that impressed everyone who witnessed her dedication. She had given Sean the gift of dying at home, surrounded by familiar comforts and the constant presence of unconditional love. In the weeks following Sean's death, Micheline received thousands of condolence messages from fans, colleagues and world leaders who had been touched by Sean's life and career, yet she found the greatest comfort in quieter moments, sitting at their piano playing the Bond themes that had connected them during his final years, or walking through their garden where they had spent countless peaceful mornings together. The Sean Connery Foundation, established with funds from his estate, would continue his lifelong commitment to education and Scottish causes. But perhaps his greatest legacy lay in the example he and Micheline had provided of love that endures beyond memory, beyond recognition, beyond even consciousness itself. Their story reminded the world that beneath the glamour of celebrity and the excitement of international fame, the most profound human experiences remain beautifully, heartbreakingly ordinary. Sean Connery, reflecting on his father's final years, spoke movingly about Micheline's devotion. She showed us what true love looks like when everything else falls away. My father was fortunate beyond measure to have found someone who loved him not for what he had achieved, but for who he was at the deepest level. Dr. Williams, who had guided the family through Sean's medical journey, noted that his case had contributed valuable insights into the relationship between deeply embedded professional memories and Alzheimer's progression. The fact that Bond remained accessible to Sean long after other memories had vanished provided researchers with new avenues for understanding how identity and memory intersect in the aging brain. The house in Nassau, where Sean spent his final years, has been preserved exactly as it was during his lifetime, with the piano still positioned where Micheline played their final concerts together. Sometimes, visitors report, you can almost hear the echoes of those Bond themes floating through the rooms where love conquered loss, and where a legend found peace in the arms of the woman who never stopped believing in the man behind the myth. Sean Connery's journey from the poverty of Edinburgh to the heights of international stardom reads like the greatest adventure story ever told. But his final chapter, the quiet years of decline, lovingly witnessed by Micheline, revealed that the most important victories are often the smallest ones: the recognition in a loved one's eyes, the comfort of familiar music, the peace of dying surrounded by devotion that asks for nothing in return, except the privilege of loving without condition. In the end, Sean Connery's most remarkable performance wasn't delivered on any movie screen. It was the simple act of allowing himself to be vulnerable, cared for, and loved completely during the most difficult passage of his extraordinary life. And Micheline's most memorable role wasn't in any film or on any stage. It was as the devoted wife who proved that true love doesn't end when memory fails, but continues undiminished until the very last breath and beyond.